The one who falls and gets back up is so much stronger than the one who never fell. Welcome back to the Neuroscience Meets Social and Emotional Learning podcast for episode 229. I'm Andrea Samadi, author and educator with a passion for learning, understanding difficult concepts, and then breaking them down so we can all use and apply the most current research to improve our productivity and results in our schools, our sports environments, and modern workplaces. Today, we're welcoming Howard Rankin back for the fourth time to the podcast to cover his newly released book, Falling to Grace. Before reading Howard's book this month, I had no idea of his story. I saw his book come out in April on his birthday, and I knew we'd have to have him back on the show to discuss it, knowing it would be full of thought-provoking lessons, but I had no idea just how personal and deep his story would be. If you recall, Howard Rankin first appeared on the podcast this time last year, episode 146, where he taught us how not to think, and that our thinking is full of cognitive biases. While reading this new book, I found myself asking a question that he'd later answer in the book, showing me it's easy to jump to a conclusion, but that we should all be aware of the limitations of our thinking. This book also brought to light that we're all spiritual beings having a human experience, and the importance of seeing the spirit in everyone and treating them without judgment, as we never know what their internal struggles might be. We learned from Dr. Marie Gervais on episode 214 on her book, The Spirit of Work, that there's a shift when we can see someone's spiritual side, and we can also connect science to everything that we do. If you've ever looked at someone and noticed their spirit, you'll see exactly what I mean. I'll never forget the first time I looked at someone and saw them shining brightly, seeing their potential that I think they were unaware of. They were sitting in front of me, and it's a moment I'll never forget, and was probably one of the reasons why I do what I do today. We all have tremendous potential within us, and this podcast was designed to help us to become aware of it and then use it. But sometimes things happen in our life that make us question the direction we're going. But there's always a way around life's obstacles. Howard's book shows us that we can move beyond anything and connect our internal struggles to the most current brain research in this quest to move towards redemption and healing. I knew Howard lost his license as a psychologist and that it was important to cover, but I didn't know how, which really didn't matter to me. None of us are exempt from the story Howard will share. No one is exempt from falling in our personal or professional lives. But if we do, will we know how to fall to grace with the lessons Howard will share with us? Howard's story of tremendous loss and pain hold lessons we can all benefit from, especially if we want to reach our highest levels of productivity and achievement in this thing we're living called life. And if there's something inside holding us back, like Howard will share, or anything else that might be bothering us internally, there is a way around it to what he calls redemption, and it's available for anyone who wants to do the work to achieve it. We can be redeemed only to the extent to which we see ourselves. Let's welcome back Howard Rankin for a fourth time to the podcast and see what we can learn from his lessons of falling to grace. Welcome back, Howard. It's so wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for coming back to the podcast for a fourth time.
Oh, my pleasure. I can't wait for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I know, really gracious of you to have me back, and I'm honored to be here.
Well, thank you. I'm sure you know I think the world of you, and I'm excited for the books that we were just talking about that are coming up. that you're going to continue to write and give us new insights to your research and how we can apply it to our daily lives. So I'm looking forward to the next 5 that we have for sure.
Yeah, great, good. Me too. Me too. Always an enlightening and enjoyable connection.
Definitely. Well, Howard, I've got to say, though, this last book was pretty painful for anyone to read and witness firsthand the tremendous loss that occurred. It was heartbreaking for me to know this happened to you and your family. I had no idea. And like the note I sent you, when I started reading your book, the lessons you're sharing with us are priceless because no one is exempt from falling. And your experience gives us all a pathway to fall with grace. So I want to thank you so much for sharing such a personal story for others to get value from and apply to our own lives. Thanks for this.
Well, and one of the values of having an experience that is difficult is that you can share that experience and what helped you to help others. And so that's really the reason I wrote the book. Was I know there are a lot of people in a similar situation. I think I might have something useful to say. And that was really the purpose, the main purpose of the book, for sure.
Definitely. Well, let's get right into it because you say in the beginning of the book that you use your own story mainly as a guide to the challenges of illuminating one's conscience and what that entails, and that people can read the circumstances in the appendix of what happened. But the general idea is that you were a well-known psychologist with a very good reputation. You'd appeared on The View and featured on 2020, as well as many other media outlets. And then you crossed a line into this gray area and everything changed for you. For those who want to read the entire story, they can just go read the book. But for this interview, I want to focus on not so much what happened, but for someone listening who might be struggling with something internally, what can we all learn from your experience about the importance of dealing with those difficult emotions of guilt or shame?
I really think it's the default setting of the mind to try to absolve yourself of any responsibility, particularly under difficult things. Every felon I ever interviewed when I was a clinical psychologist, I mean, everyone said, "Oh yeah, well, the judge let me down, or the lawyer really screwed up, or this guy also, he should never have said that, or this guy should have done that." Yeah, but you did walk into a bank with a gun. But it's the default setting. It's and here's the point. Maybe you were treated harshly, but that does not absolve you of your initial responsibility for what you did. Own up. And as I say, I think the default setting of the mind, particularly in today's world, is, oh, I was a victim. I didn't do anything. It's not my fault. And that's the worst thing that you can do. It'll keep you trapped in that cage of misinformation, lies, deceit, self-deceit. And you'll never move forward. You just won't. So the first thing you absolutely have to get to is acceptance. I accept responsibility for what I did. And interestingly, of course, when I look at these things, I did see a parallel between the 5 stages of grief, denial, depression, bargaining, and eventually acceptance. Acceptance is critical. And we'll talk about this as we go, because one of the things that I perhaps was shocked about the most was how much being honest, really how powerful that was. Just being honest and saying, yep, I screwed up. I should never have done that.
Do you think there's a way of being too honest, like of of taking on the world's issues all on yourself. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, like all virtues and values, they can be misused, you know, like being too compassionate means your boundaries collapse and you can end up being codependent. So that's not very good, but that's a misuse of those things. So again, taking, owning up to things that really aren't yours to own up isn't actually honesty,
oh,
is it? It's
oh,
it's it's somewhat of a deception for whatever reason. So I still stick by this, that those values, those core values, and particularly what I learned here, honesty was amazing. Amazing.
and one of my questions later on just seems pertinent now, that we learned when I was working with Bob Proctor in the seminars about taking responsibility for your thoughts, feelings, and actions and your results, that you don't blame anybody else along the way. And that just seems like what you're saying right now, that whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, whatever you take action on, and whatever results you get are all yours. And that was a huge thing to learn when you're younger, so that you don't
Right.
blame other people along the way. Well,
Right.
you're in sales. Well, the leads are weak because you gave me a bad set of leads. No,
Right.
you don't know how to close the lead.
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
that whole idea, right? That's what you're saying. Take responsibility for your actions and
Absolutely.
thoughts, feeling
Absolutely.
along the way.
Absolutely. Because if you don't do that, you're going to spend all your time trying to justify yourself, and you're not going to get to a solution that way. You're just not. You're just going to be stuck in the same situation, the same mindset. And the reality is, you need to move on.
Got it. So in your book, you actually mentioned that some studies suggest that 70% of people who experience trauma, so something happens to them bad, they either come back stronger, but there's been concern that it can be misleading. And there's a large number of people who struggle to get back to their pre-trauma baseline or never recover at all. And I noticed this when I was interviewing someone recently who also lost their license, that there was so much pain around that whole thing of loss and everything that happened to the family. Whether someone's in the public eye or not, your book really is a guide to help begin this healing process after a fall, whatever it is. But can you describe the stages that we should expect to go through when rebuilding our life after such a significant loss? Where do we even begin?
Well, typically what happens is you're very angry. You know, you think that you're probably angry with yourself if you have a degree of honesty, but you're also angry with, people who are accusing you or judging you, or literally the judge. People who are, buying into a story that probably has been, changed and manipulated and framed in a different way than you would like it seen. So typically, there's a lot of anger, maybe some revenge fantasies that keep going around in your mind, and some anger at yourself, hopefully, for putting yourself and other people, because it's not just yours. It's your spouse, your kids, everyone. It's not just your problem, and so anger definitely is part of it. But there comes a point where you have to stop that. You have to stop that because that kind of keeps you sort of in the victim mentality and not accepting responsibility. We have a binary brain. Man, if you're mad at somebody else, you can't be at fault. Yeah, you can be mad at somebody else because they did you wrong, but that doesn't mean you didn't do anything wrong, right? So it's very easy to find fault with other people, accusers, lawyers, judges, the newspaper, whoever, they're not perfect. And you're going to see them as betraying you, and you're going to be angry at them. And I've seen people locked in that state for years, maybe the rest of their life. And that's not helpful. You're being controlled by them, even as you're mad at them. You can't do that. And so that anger, for me, it was, that anger. And then I came to a point when, stop. You can't go on like this, right? You can't. Ask yourself, what is the best that could happen out of this situation? If in 5 years' time this turned out to be an amazing situation, why? How can I make that? How can I contribute to that? And that mindset is really critical because it gets you moving from just thinking about all these revenge on other people to, okay, it's on me. I'm the only one who can fix this, right? And I've got to fix my problem, not everyone else's problem.
Exactly. That's hard. As I was reading your story, I kept thinking, obviously, with my primitive brain, how could this entire situation been prevented in the first place? And I know that thinking is flawed. What cognitive bias is, how could this all have been prevented be? Let's just go there, because I know you're the king of cognitive biases.
Yeah. Well, I think, and perhaps the listeners do need a little bit of background here. The situation was that I had seen a female client in 2005, borderline personality with some trauma issues, very seductive. Very seductive. And for the 3 years we worked together, I told her, look, this isn't about that at all. This is about you overcoming the problems you've got. We worked pretty well together for 3 years. And then she moved on to another therapist, which I was sort of relieved at, to be honest. We done pretty well. She moved on. Then she said, well, I'd like to come back and see you. And I said, well, not really as a therapist. I don't want to do it. She said, no, I don't. I just want to keep you updated on what's going on. That's fine. And so she started coming back periodically to see me. We did this over 4 years. And one time in 2012, leaving my office. And of course, I knew what she was trying to do. And I knew it. There was part of me that kind of liked it, I guess, And as she left my office, she kissed me, and then it degenerated over a very short period of time into a consensual relationship. And then I said, no, we can't do this anymore. And then a few weeks later, I got a call from the licensing board saying somebody had filed a complaint against me for sexual misconduct. I knew this woman was seductive. She's classic borderline personality. I knew that. I also knew some other things, that when I first met her, she said she had been raped by a police officer. But as I got to know her, that kind of wasn't quite right. She'd been trying to seduce this guy for ages too. Okay. But me, stupid me, although hindsight is 2020, why didn't I realize the potential there, that having got me involved in a relationship, she was now going to turn around, distort it, say I molested her, what have you, and hopefully get some money out of it by suing me. That's, it's obvious seeing that.
Mm-hmm.
But, and there was part of me who knew that, but, she got the better of me. And, I didn't say, no, that's it, stop it, which I had been doing for 7 years, though she hadn't come on quite that strong over 7 years. I didn't say that. And I should have. I should have said, no, this is going nowhere good, and I shouldn't be doing that. It's putting me at risk. I shouldn't do it. But I did. So looking back, you can say there were obvious signs there. Obvious signs that this was going nowhere at all, right? A weak moment, probably.
Yeah. Even with the fact you wrote the book, Intuitive Rationality,
Mhm.
Did you ever think this person in front of me with this borderline personality disorder could potentially destroy my life, career, and future like that openly?
Interesting. I'm not sure I ever put it that way, although probably I should have. I don't know that I said that, and perhaps if somebody like you had said that, knew what was going on, and said, Howard, you know, this is too dangerous. Don't mess with her, you know, just don't. I might have listened, but I didn't. I didn't tell anyone about that. It was just me. It was in my own head. Did I think it was a risk? Yes. Did I really weigh all the risks and the potential possibilities? No. And had I done so, I wouldn't have done this. Right.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's varying degrees of acknowledgement of potential future consequences,
Right.
but mine weren't strong enough,
Mhm.
clearly. Right.
Yeah. No, that's all understandable. And I was actually thinking about these questions on my morning hike this morning. And, the whole time I was writing them, I was thinking about your fall to grace. And then I actually thought, what about the other party's fall to grace? And I thought, is emotional intelligence not enough? Do we now need to know about personality disorders with people? Where do we even begin when we're looking at people and thinking
It's a good
about
question.
a safe person for me to spend time with? Because
Right. No, I think that's really a good question. I think it's probably something that most people in the coaching or therapy business probably do think about, you know, because the atmosphere and all the legalities around being a therapist, I mean, got to the point near the end of my career where don't I really don't want to go to court to testify what I think, you know.
right.
I just don't want to be put in the middle of this situation. I remember, and and this was before obviously this happened, but I was beginning to become much more, and I'm sure this is true of many therapists, very sensitive. I had some friends who said, "We're having some marital difficulties. We'd really like to come to you." I said, "No way." I don't want to go there, you know? And if you start taking that attitude, and there are cases and things like difficult couples counseling that is really difficult, that, yeah, I think a lot of people say, I'm not going there. I'm not going there.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
you also talked about false accusations and that our limited brain doesn't easily undo past associations and emotions, especially those flashbulb moments that
Right.
have high emotion. And it requires effort for someone to change the things that we've heard because we've got our biased, egocentric thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a world that everything spreads so quickly online and
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
permanent, how do you deal with your personal life being broadcast all over the internet for people to read and then put their own biases on what they're reading?
Well, it is true. And you know, it's got really ugly. It's got really ugly. I've had this. Fortunately, it's a fantasy. um, but being on some TV show and the presenter, you know, misrepresents what I did. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, you took the lead. You seduced this woman. No, I didn't. I mean, this was mutual. But now you've said that in front of a million people.
Mm.
That's what they hear. Even if he comes back and says, well, no, okay, perhaps I should rephrase that. It's too late. It's too late.
Right,
He's put that image in somebody's mind, and they're going to have to work hard to get rid of it. Right.
right.
That's why first impression, you can never get a second chance to make a first impression. And I see that all the time where people try to frame the narrative. That's the framing effect. Frame it and make you look like this. And even if subsequently they say, well, no, okay, I realize that perhaps I can't, it's too late. It's out there. And how many people actually go back and say, well, actually, sorry, yeah, perhaps I shouldn't have said that. Nobody says that anyway. But even if they did, it's still too late. It's still too late. That impression is right there.
Now, Howard, we didn't have to deal with this when we were growing up, right? Like, I remember someone said something about me that I didn't like in my college years. And that comment just was gone after a few weeks because we didn't have the internet back then. And
no, that's true. That's right. You don't.
You got stuck in this because now this damaging behavior of whatever, I think it was an article that you wanted removed. I couldn't find it, so it's gone now. But what should we all know about the importance of our digital imprint, and the legal action that we can take if there is something that you don't like that someone says about you?
Well, it's challenging because the local paper that covered this had some comments by the chairman of the Board of Ethics and Examiners, who was the chairman overseeing my case. And he misrepresented it. He said, well, he was quoted as saying, this was an open and shut case. Well, no, it wasn't. I argued she was a former client, which she was. She'd been out of therapy 4 years. There's a distinction there. So it wasn't an open and shut case. And then he said, in my 10 years serving on this is the first person we've had to. No. First of all, he hadn't been serving 10 years. He'd been serving 7 years. And secondly, there was at least one other person who lost his license. And there were, based on subsequent research of mine, 220 people over those 10 years who did not renew their license for one reason or another. And one can assume that probably among some of them were some underlying ethical issues. They just choose to not renew their license, and that was it. So, he totally misrepresented it from my perspective. Now, what do you do? So I went to the newspaper, said, you need to remove this. Oh, no, we're not going to remove it. No, not going to remove it. It's there. It's there. What do you do?
Do you you go see a lawyer and you now pursue, but now
you can. Okay. So let's look at that based on, my philosophy that came out of this. Well, you could go see a lawyer, right? And you could go through this, and maybe you would get a decision you would want. Maybe you wouldn't. You would spend thousands of dollars, which you do not have. You would be locked in this thing for maybe a couple of years, maybe longer, during which time this thing would still be all over the internet. What's the point? Is that the way to spend your time, energy, money? I didn't think so.
Right. So
I didn't think so.
You let it go. You just
let it go. Let it go. Let it go. Yes, it probably shouldn't have been out there. I'm just not gonna, because the other thing would be that now I'm still letting these people control my life. That's not helpful. That's not helpful to me. And, maybe I would have won, maybe I wouldn't, what would have happened? I can't really see a whole lot of good coming from it.
Right.
And that's not where I needed to put my energy. My energy needed to put on making this a really positive event in my life. How do I do that from here? What do I do? Okay. That's where all my energy and time needs to go on that. Nothing else. Nothing. You can't, I understand why you'd want to do it, but don't. I'm not, there may be some cases where, you've been obviously screwed and you can win millions of dollars and all. Maybe. But for most people, that's not the situation. That is not the situation.
So you mentioned that there were people who make up their minds based on what they're going to read online. So whether you let it go and it's still there, people are going to make up their own minds. But for the people who know you, nothing changes, like your son, who you went and told the story to, and he said, I know who you are. What did you learn from your son when he said that to you?
Yeah, so this was interesting. So we knew it was going to come out in the newspaper and people would know about it. And my son had just graduated from Duke, and like 4 days after graduating, I mean, he was in the ROTC program, and he had joined the army, and he was sort of called up for training like 4 days after graduating. And he was down in Fort Benning in Georgia. And my wife and I knew it was going to be in the newspaper. We wanted to be the ones to tell him. Very important, very important. You be the one to tell your loved ones, your friends, as much as you can, certainly your family. And so we got on the phone and we explained what had happened. And at this point, my wife had been very supportive and, said it's not going to change anything and what have you. And so we got him on the phone and we told him that. We told him all that. And he said, "Dad, doesn't matter. I know who you are. And Mom, thank you so much for being so courageous enough to work this out." And he said, "By the way, do you guys need any money?" And I mean, we both broke out crying. Yeah, I mean, he's an amazing young man. But that was, because we were authentic and honest, he could be authentic and honest. If we got on and I had started to say, "But, really, it wasn't my fault and I should have done this and this person's crazy and don't believe anything you read." Yeah, I don't think it's not the same. It's not the same.
Comes back to taking responsibility that you opened up with for everything, our thoughts, feelings, and action.
Absolutely. And so that's hard, but it is the most rewarding thing, because when you do something like this, you do feel like an outcast. You do feel you don't belong. You think everyone hates you, or at least thinks you're an idiot, and you really overreact. You just see yourself in a very, very dark light, and in an exaggeratedly dark light. What you have to have are experiences where people say, "I don't care, I know who you are," or "Yeah, I'm sure she, whatever." That is so reassuring to become part of the tribe, or a tribe again.
Right.
Humiliation and shame is, hey, you're isolated, you're out. Yeah. Nobody wants to know you. But when you make a connection like that, it is everything. And the way you make a connection by that is being honest. Is being honest. So true. Again, to all these people who came up to me and, in church, first the thing in the newspaper came out on a Friday, and I was serving as an usher in church on Sunday. So here's my first public appearance in church after this is on the front page of the local newspaper. I was so apprehensive. People came up to me, shook my hand, said, "Howard, sorry to hear about that. I know who you are. It doesn't change my opinion of you," or what have you. And it was so overwhelming. I mean, I thought it would be enough just to maybe smile a bit, but to get that was just, 4 or 5 people, 6 people came up. Everyone came. Wow. And I was expecting them all to turn away and shun me, and I'd be off on my own in the corner. But au contraire, no. And that's massive. That is massive when you feel you're disconnected and nobody wants to know you, and they come up and want to support you. They'll only want to do that if you're honest.
True, Howard. When you're talking, it made me think different situation, but shame and guilt are attached. When I went through divorce and had a different last name suddenly, and I was so ashamed or afraid to reach out to some of my old mentors that I know were very religious, and I was terrified to reach out to them. Same feelings. I feel like you're an outcast, you failed. And then I really needed support, or I needed advice for this one person that I've interviewed, and reached out to him. And I thought, I'm going to die because he's going to see my email has a different last name. I just remember the feeling of, being afraid. And then the answer was, wow, look at your last name. Do you know the spiritual connotation of what Samadi
Interesting.
means.
Uh-huh.
And I just remember thinking, I didn't expect that
Right.
acceptance,
Yep.
didn't expect it at all. Just like you were overwhelmed with the people that came up to you. You expect
Yep.
what you think. You're conditioned to think,
Right.
I'm now an outcast. You're not going to be my friend anymore because I don't align with your values. And that's not the case, which is nice. But what about the other side? Were there people that you thought were your friends that you figured weren't anymore?
Yeah, there was one of my former clients, a woman who actually kind of discovered, because her dad was a psychiatrist and told her where to look, discovered what had happened. And she went to the newspaper and told them. And actually, this is in the book, not only did she go to the newspaper and tell them, she actually found out, I'm not sure how she did this, but found out the phone number of a mother of another client of mine. And she called her up and said, "Oh, well, you won't believe what I found out about Dr. Rankin. You're going to find out all the dirt on him in the newspaper and all the stuff tomorrow." And somebody that I had worked with and been sort of a friend of had also contributed to this newspaper piece, putting in a totally inappropriate comment, you know? Yeah, you get to find out who really are your friends and
Right.
who
Right.
aren't. And so even though that's painful, it's kind of useful.
True. True.
Yep,
And
yep.
some lessons really struck a chord with me as I was reading through the book, because of course it burns me to think that there's people that want to profit from your misery, right? And I
Mhm.
just, from how we were taught way back to look at the spirit in someone and see the spirit in someone. I talk about it in the backstory. It's probably why I do this podcast, that we look at everyone and see the spirit and their potential. So,
Mm.
how do you get past that? You say, for the most part, the best way is to ignore people like this instead of scratching their eyes out, that you want to do.
Mhm.
But besides meditation and long jogs, how do you rise above operating at the low level that we want to be at with people like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to see that a couple of things really that I think are valuable. First of all, it's a waste of your time. Secondly, they still have an influence on you. I mean, the biggest freedom you have is this person doesn't influence me anymore. I don't care. But if you say, "Oh, I'm going to respond to that," well, they do have an influence on you. They are controlling you. Do you really want them to do that? No. The best thing is to ignore them. I mean, literally and figuratively in your mind. Okay, they can think whatever they think. If they cross a line, perhaps I'll sue them for libel or what have you, but I'm not going to engage in it. It is just not worth it. And so many of us get caught up in trying to fight these things that are a total waste of time, effort, and in a lot of cases, money. I'm sure you've heard about those divorce cases and I've been, unfortunately, the therapist involved in them, where one party is determined to win, no matter what it means to their kids, no matter what it means to their family. They will spend, I mean, I had one guy, he found the best, what was considered to be the best assessor of marriages. He would write the reports on the relationship assessment. Best one in the state. And when he didn't like what he said, he then hired the next best one to contradict it. And this just went on and on. He actually complained against me. He complained about another therapist because he didn't say what he wanted to say. I mean, it's insane. It's insane.
Right.
Don't get caught up in it. Just don't. Um,
So even in one of our interviews, and you'll know the one that I'm mentioning, someone wasn't in agreement of some of the work that you did with the schools, didn't agree with the technology or something. And I remember that you didn't challenge him. And I felt like that's such a learned way to be, that you allow people to maybe critique your work, and you didn't fight back, or you didn't challenge him with statistics on how it was an effective way to measure student performance. So how do you get there? Is that just life experience that
Yeah, you got to try. Yeah, I do think it goes against the sort of natural defense. So I think you have to work at that. You have to be aware of why you would do that, and you have to have practice at that, to change your brain's response. Perhaps send out a flip, cynical, sarcastic reply, but basically don't engage.
Right.
Again, you're giving people too much power when you do that, and I don't see any value in that. So this did really hammer that home to me. It really did.
I noticed your calmness and peacefulness during that interaction. And I thought, wow, Howard's done a lot of work in this area, because I could just tell from how he dealt with his comments. And then we moved on to something else. So I just thought, wow.
That's interesting. You noticed that.
Absolutely. And then when I saw how you tied the brain to this, I thought, well, how did an understanding of your brain help you with this and in life, that I noticed in that interview?
That's interesting. Well, we program our brains by what we do, what we think. I mean, the brain is very, very trainable. It can probably do some amazing things that nobody's thought of training it to do. So it's probably got a lot more potential, and in many ways, I hope it does, because in some ways our brains need an upgrade, given we haven't really had an upgrade for millions of years, and we need one because the world is different. So it is being aware, it is having an understanding and an emotional connection to an idea, and then it is actually acting and behaving in that particular way, which changes the brain. That sets the opportunity for neuroplasticity by doing things, not just by thinking about them, but by doing things. Well, maybe thinking about them. There are some studies where intense visualization probably changes the brain too. But anyway, you have to do something. So just having an idea about something isn't enough. No, I was just thinking that, interestingly enough, like so many things in life, I think back to my childhood. And to some extent, I remember one very specific instance where I got really angry with one of my friends. But for the most part, I kind of just blew it off, and I didn't. So, there may be something more inborn in me for whatever reason, or trained. And part of that was my dad was a great guy, he had a good sense of humor, but he was very stressed out and could be a little explosive. And so we always went around, just be careful of what you say. And so probably from an early age, I learned to keep my mouth shut and just observe and be a little bit more, mindful. So that probably contributed to that ability.
Got it. Interesting. What did you learn from Mary Frances O'Connor and her book, The Grieving Brain, that we could all learn from to kind of dive deeper into how our brains influence everything we go through?
Well, yeah, the brain does. And again, what has fascinated me, again, probably for most of my life, but certainly at different stages, and specifically now, the whole aspect of consciousness and what we focus on. What we focus on, and the automatic feeling or the thought that comes with it that we then accept. We were just talking about this before we came on. Both of us lost beloved dogs in the very recent past. And you can look at that and say, oh, I miss him so much, which is true. I'm sure I miss him so much. But then you can look at it and say, well, my grief is proportional to the joy that he brought us. If he hadn't brought us joy, I wouldn't be grieving. I wouldn't care, right? And that he is part of this whole nature, our world, where love can be found. He's just another example of love, and we need to be grateful for that. Yes, he's not here right now, but love still exists. And the next dogs that I'm sure we'll both get will be just as loving and amazing. And I think keeping that big picture in mind is important to moderate that, because it's very easy in grief to get really focused on what you've lost and what's not there anymore. And of course, a certain amount of that's necessary, but at some point you can move on from there and not deny that you miss this animal, but just appreciate the experience that it gave you.
Right. And I loved what you had said before we started, that everything exists, that in this consciousness in the world, that everything is here still. We haven't lost.
Right. Yeah, no, I did, and the dog still exists in some ways, the echoes of the bark, his favorite seat, whatever it is, chasing a squirrel, whatever. It's all still there, just in a slightly different way. You mentioned you had some thoughts on your walk, on your jog today. I had some on my walk, which were around creativity, and I thought of this example. You look up in the clouds and you say, "Oh my gosh, don't those clouds? They look like an elephant." And somebody says, "Oh my gosh, that's so clever of you." No, you just noticed it. It was there. You noticed it. You didn't create it. You just noticed it. And in many respects, everything is there that we need. We just got to notice it. And of course, we don't.
That's what I wanted to ask. Have you felt the energy of your dog around since he's been gone?
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Energy is always there. So that's another reassuring sign. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Oh, he's still here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I can't wait till you come out with that next book. That's going to be interesting for sure. And we talked, my next question for you was going back to accepting responsibility. I think we really covered that. I don't think I need to ask you more. But maybe if we could just talk a little bit about how trauma impacts the body. So you mentioned Bessel van der Kolk and Dr. Leaf as examples in the book. Why do we need to forgive ourselves as well as others for our physical and mental health?
Good question. My perception of it is we have this amazing subconscious mind, body, spirit. You've had John Leaf on your show. I've had him on mine. Amazing guy. The Secret Language of Cells was a landmark book for me to read, right? It's just mind-blowing, these trillions of cells inside us connecting all the time in these most amazing ways. Just mind-blowing. And that is potentially who we are. And then unfortunately along comes consciousness and, we start misinterpreting things or thinking of things only in one way, or not, closing our eyes, so not really seeing what's there, what's possible, and just, we shape ourselves through that. And I think that's a big misunderstanding that we have about consciousness and about the treatment of health general and mental health in particular. The history of the treatment of mental health, even to this day, considered is really a tragedy. It's tragedy. And we don't understand it. Well, perhaps we do, and people are beginning to realize that, there is this conscious, subconscious, mind, body, spirit. They have to be aligned. Your body knows what it needs. Your body knows what it needs. And it'll send every microsecond things into your consciousness. And you think, oh, yeah, yeah. And you think you thought the idea. No, you didn't. Your mind, body, spirit thought it. There's a difference in consciousness between awareness, oh, something's just popped into my head, and agency. Oh, I've just created this connection in these thoughts. So a lot of time we're not in agency, we're in awareness. Something pops into our head, brought to us by our mind, body, spirit, based on the best guess and all our old habits about what's happening. Yeah, of course it is. We don't stop and ask, wait a minute, is that right? What's it saying? And perhaps nowhere is that boundary more evident than in trauma. Okay, so in really traumatic events, you lose the consciousness and the memory of that event because it's too painful. But those sensory experiences still linger in the body. And they may manifest itself in different ways. I had my most amazing client, a woman who had severe trauma and, as a result, what used to be called multiple personality disorders. And they develop because the traumatic memories that each of these bits of consciousness hold are so painful, they can't be shared. And so what's interesting is each alter ego has that secret, but they also have physiological characteristics, right? Amazing. One of them, this actually happened. One of the alter egos came with a migraine.
Wow.
Okay. And the client came in and said, oh, Dr. Rankin, I got this horrible migraine. Just nothing I can do about it. I said, okay. Because I knew which alter ego it was. I plotted them all out. We did a hypnosis session where I communicated with that alter ego and said, no, time to rest, go back. She came out of the hypnosis and said, oh my God, what do you do? The migraine's completely gone. They're completely gone.
Wow.
Now, that's an extreme example, but it is an example of what happens. We get this disconnect. So our body is feeling all this stuff, but we can't access it consciously. And there's the challenge. And the challenge is you actually do have to access it consciously. Because if you don't, you'll still have this fragmentation of yourself. Really, it's fragmented personalities rather than multiple personalities. You still have this fragmentation. And so you have to resolve those traumas. You have to bring them into consciousness. You have to deal with them. You have to almost exorcise them. And that's what happened with this woman. It took us 12 years. And then she was able to move on with her life, really for the first time, as her, not dominated subconsciously by all these traumatic memories. They're buried inside of us. Taking meds, symptomatic relief. You've got to access them and you've got to get them out.
And do you think that some strategies to help get these events to the surface could be tapping and saying, even though going through the routine, you've heard of that, even though this
EMDR.
happened. Yeah. Do you think that's one strategy?
It is. I mean, I think there are a variety of strategies, and the EMDRs, I think, certainly would work for some people. I think one of the problems, again, with being too rational is we assume all strategies work for all people. No, they probably wouldn't. And people at different stages of their recovery from trauma. But EMDR is a respected technique for helping bring things to surface. And in some ways, the therapist has to be very clued into what's going on, understanding it, and navigate their own way that works for this individual, works for this person. And that's It's a big challenge, no question about that. But well worth it in the end. Well worth it.
Sure.
And in the same way, we all have those things buried, may not be traumas, inside ourselves. Hopefully we can access them, bring them into consciousness and examine them and see them differently.
So we can all reach our highest levels of productivity.
Absolutely.
Lifetime. Howard, if I was to sum up the top lessons learned from your story, Falling to Grace, I'm just going to take a stab at it. And I'm just going to say that I think the first one is accepting responsibility for our thoughts, feelings, actions, everything we do, and not blaming others.
Correct.
For the things that happen to us. What else comes to mind as a top lesson that you want people to take away?
I think being more expansive in their thinking and challenging their thinking, recognizing that there are all sorts of opportunities out there to be seen in terms of how you view the world and yourself. A lot of people are very negative about themselves. They don't need to be. They just keep repeating that and it becomes a habit. They never challenge it, right? We've all made mistakes. Nobody's perfect. We're stupid human beings, okay? Right? And maybe the biggest thing you can do is accept that and look at yourself honestly. And again, it's interesting because this is related to trauma. I wanted to tell people, I started writing and using my background as a way to help other people tell their stories and writing content. And, whenever anyone, approached me and said, oh, I'd be interested in your work and help me with this book, I felt immediately that I had to tell them. Now, maybe that was a bit oversensitive at the time, but over time, I still do that. I tell them. And there's one story that if we got time, I'd really like to tell.
Definitely.
So this was just a few months after this, and I was looking for ghostwriting gigs. And this guy, a really interesting guy, very successful businessman, reached out to me and said, oh, Howard, when he chatted, yeah, I'd really like you to help me with my book. And I thought, oh, I'm going to have to tell him. So I told him what happened, and there was a silence at the end of the phone. And then he said, hey, they lost my gain.
Wow.
And I could have reached through the phone and hugged that guy. But, the technical problems in doing that prohibited that. But we worked together. He's an amazing guy, one of the youngest vice president in banking, and just incredible. As we go on the story, he tells me that actually he has Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. And actually, as we're working together, he's beginning to deteriorate. In fact, one time he calls me, we're Skyping at that time from his hospital bed. But, he's an amazing guy. We're doing this, and then one time his wife called me and said, he's not doing well. Let's get this done as quickly as we can. So, worked really hard, did it, got it all together, had a great conversation with him. We finally finished the book. He appreciated it. You're on my team. And he died the next day. And that had such an impact on me. It still does, obviously. That if I hadn't lost my license, I would have never met that guy. Right? I wouldn't be doing that. I wouldn't have helped him leave a legacy. I wouldn't. And suddenly, that made it so much more meaningful to me. Mm-hmm. You never know where you're going to get that meaning from. But, again, that's where the honesty and being able to tell that without fear of people saying, oh, you're an idiot if you did that. Oh, I don't want anything to do with you. And I'm sure I lost a couple of gigs because of that, because people didn't want to work with me. That's fine. That's your choice. But, like with trauma, and Bob Moore, who's a big trauma expert, said on one of my podcasts, when he hears people talking about their trauma and they start to cry, he knows they haven't resolved it. And in the same way, if I were telling stories but thinking, oh God, what's this person going to think? Oh, I hadn't resolved it. Right. But if I've resolved it, I can say to you, honestly, here's what I did. Up to you to do with it what you want. I don't care.
Oh, Howard. Howard, I want to thank you so much for writing this book to help all of us learn how to fall to grace like you did, and reminding us that we're all human beings, hardwired with emotions. And that's a whole other podcast with Jack Pence. But you gave us such an understanding of our brain and learn how we control the feelings we've attached to these hardwired emotions, helping us to rise above our primitive selves and be our best selves, like you've shown us we can all accomplish. So I want to thank you so much for all you contribute to the world with your books, your podcast, and your teachings. I've definitely learned how not to think, and many important lessons from you from falling to grace that would be a blessing if we could all master in our lifetime. Thank you so much, Howard.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. So much appreciation for that. Really do. Thank you.
Thank you.